Welcome to Political Trade Secrets, an inside look at campaigns and politics, where we pull back the curtain, look under the hood, and investigate all aspects of politics and how elections are won. Now, here's your host, Dustin Olson.
Well, hello there. Thank you for joining us today. This is Political Trade Secrets. I'm your host, Dustin Olson, and thank you very much. Sean is on holiday today, but he will be back with us soon. Thank you so much for stopping. We're going to be talking about 7 great reads for strategic thinking, and going through some of my favorites. It's not an exhaustive list. It's just 7 I think are really accessible. They're books that you could pick up now, and I think would actually expand your ability to think strategically, and a lot of great ideas that I think you could probably implement today. So we'll be talking about that in a moment. If you'd like to be a part of Political Trade Secrets, if you'd like to be part of our Political Trade Secrets insider community, then I highly recommend that you stop by politicaltradesecrets.com and sign up to be a Political Trade Secrets insider, get exclusive stuff. We're going to be rolling out some new content here in the coming month or so that we'll be sending to folks. So you can get our regular emails, you can get any of those exclusives. So thank you very much for that. As well as I will be sending out the 7 great reads for strategic thinking. I'll be sending out the list later today on our text chain. If you'd like to follow us on our text chain, you can do that by going to your phone and texting me at 202-918-3345. So definitely want to make sure that you stop by and you text us, and you can ask questions. You can ask questions of me. You can ask questions of Sean. That's actually going directly to us, and really do appreciate all of you who are sending us messages and asking questions, and the conversations we're having with folks. Really great input, because ultimately what we're here to do is we're here to empower you as our fellow American citizens to be the most effective citizens possible, but also to be powerful political leaders there in your own community. And one of the ways that you could do that, because there's people out there besides yourself who maybe need to step up and run for office. Maybe they are somebody that really could make a difference on their school board, can make a difference in the state legislature, can make a difference on the city council. So if you'd like to inspire and empower others to be the most powerful political leaders that they can be for their community and for their state and for our country, then join the Share Force. So join Share Force, make a difference, help us reignite American patriotism, because that's really what it's about. People that love this country, love the founding of this country, love the principles that make up this country, and are willing to step up, to show up, and to speak up on behalf of that, and to really reignite American patriotism. And it's as simple as, to be part of the Share Force is whatever platform you're on. We're 12 different platforms right now, live across the internet. And every single one of them has a function where you can share, you can retweet. Right down there, you can see it. And you can share this program, and who might you actually light that spark that they might step up, show up, and speak up in their community and make the difference. So please do that, and we really do appreciate folks who do that. And as we go through this conversation today, please post your comments, your questions through the magic of the internet. It all comes back here, and I'm able to follow up with that. If you're watching on the replay, we jump in there and we respond to folks as well. So wherever you are, be a part of the conversation as we think about strategic thinking, and we talk about that. And really, we're going to be talking about it in the realm of political strategy, but one of the first things I'm going to talk about is some of the principles, some of the big ideas, the key concepts that I think you can take away from all of these, and how we use it in our campaigns. And the first idea is what I call fusion strategy, and also comparative strategy. This is something I developed many years ago as a young guy getting into politics, working on campaigns. I realized there really wasn't a great school that you could go to learn political strategy. It wasn't something that was out there. There's some day courses you could do, and you'd learn a little bit about the tactics on a campaign, but you really didn't have a way to learn that. So I went about studying completely different areas of study, disciplines. One person I studied was Billy Graham and the Billy Graham Crusades, and applied that to politics. There's a lot of stuff I learned from that. I looked at military strategy. I looked at business strategy. I just started learning from all these different places because, as I saw it, strategy really, if you think about it as, you have this landscape, and you're going on a journey. You're at point A, and you have to go out there somewhere off in the distance to point B. And there's mountains, there's rivers, there's, the environment, the weather, all these different things are going to be happening. There's going to be day and night that you're going to be traversing this terrain. And you have to figure out, to get from point A to point B, you have to understand what resources do you have currently, and then you have to come up with what resources can you bring to bear along the way. And considering all of that, what's the path that you can take? There's probably many paths you can take, but what's the path that you can take? So I thought about that, and I really thought about strategy as a universal idea about how to get from point A to point B, considering all those different factors. And the idea there is that you can have an insight from studying something that's completely different. So maybe you're watching this and you're a banker, or you have a new tech startup. You can probably learn something from political strategy that is going to make a difference in your world. Because what you can see is, you can see the things that are the same, and then you can also get the things that are different, and it gives you a little bit of a little bit of a better insight, a little bit of more fresh eyes, is how I would look at it. So that's one of the first ideas that I think all of these books I'm going to be coming to in a moment really have helped me develop for myself. The next one is what I call our 4 pillars of strategy, and we'll talk about that. There's one book in particular that inspired that, but for the the where you're going, the why you're going there, and the how you get there, and then the actual doing of it. So we're going to be talking about that, and then what I've talked about often on the show is something I developed from one of these books in particular, is what I call the Olson strategy sweet spot. And it's that Venn diagram, the 3 circles that you have, your strengths and your opponent's weaknesses overlapped with what the voters care about. When those 3 circles, where they overlap, that's your sweet spot. That's where, if you focus in on that, you're choosing the battleground that's going to be the most advantageous for you. And that's one of the ideas we'll talk about here in a moment. And then another thing that we do in our campaigns, and it's really almost magical. We've done a few campaigns this summer. It's amazing. We call it our campaign performance system. And it's just a system of interlocking practices. We talked about a couple weeks ago, one of our strategic principles, strategic maxims that we call what you do daily gets done. Those series of things that you're doing daily in your campaign or your organization, that working together, they start to create some momentum. And that goes into what I call the strategic flywheel, or what's called a virtuous cycle, that you have these actions, they all start to build off of each other, and they start to create momentum from that. So those are some of the key concepts and ideas that I think these books really have helped me learn throughout this time. So if you have any books that you'd like to suggest that you think are great for strategic thinking, if you have anything that you think would as I go through this, you can say, this is that, I can see how that could apply to politics, or I could see how, what was missing when I was on a campaign that lost, like that was something that people weren't doing, or whatever it is. I just like to get your input as we walk through this. So without further ado, I'm going to start going through the list here in the moment. And I see, have a comment here. I found this book that made me think in a different way as a political leader. Love Your Enemies, How Decent People Can Save America from the Culture of Contempt by Arthur Brooks. Well, thank you very much. And that's ultimately what any great book is going to do, is it's going to give you a whole new context, that really a new filter, a new window on the world that is going to have you experience the world differently, or have the world occur to you differently, and things that you wouldn't have been able to see or experience all of a sudden become apparent to you. We talked about this earlier in the summer, the reticular activating system, part of the brain that ultimately has to filter out the millions of bits of data that are bombarding your brain at every single second. You can't handle all that. So it chunks it down to a filter of what your conscious brain will deal with, and which is why, the idea, one of the authors will talk about, has the concept of two movies on the same screen. That's how that's possible. How in this country right now we can have two different views of reality, and yet the base reality clearly is the same, but people have completely different experiences and they think that they're absolutely right about that. So without further ado, I'm going to pick out one of my books. I've got so many books here. It's going to take me a second to do that. Of course, it's the one on the bottom. So first book, I've talked about this one before, and it is great. Most of the books I'm going to talk about are newer books that might talk about older books. I really like the older books, but if someone's really wanting to, boost their strategic thinking, they will want to, I think, focus on the newer books, because ultimately some of the older books are hard. But The Art of War, that's number one. Art of War is by Sun Tzu, Master Sun, also known as Sun Wu. There's an idea that maybe he's a composite of a number of people, but ultimately Sun Tzu lived, I think, about 2,500 years ago, and he kind of was a hermit. He was up in the hills. He'd been in many battles, but he thought long and deeply about the question of war, and ultimately he was not for war. He was for only engaging in war if, after considering all the factors that you saw that there was an opportunity to win, and not to go to war willy-nilly, not to have conflict if it wasn't for a purpose and you weren't going to actually achieve your objective or had a good opportunity to do that. So this is the only one that I'm going to take of the ancients I think are definitely one of the ones I would recommend. First of all, this book that I have right here, most of it is about the background of the book. It doesn't actually have the book until the very end. So it's a very short book, actually. And you go through, one of the first ideas is that he talks about is, when you go into the ancestral temple and you contemplate and you pray on all the different factors that could be at play in the war, and what he calls initial estimations. And that really is another way to say it is measure twice, cut once. So, really consider all the different factors. Think about the factors of, as I talked about, going from point A to point B and the terrain. He talks about heaven and earth, and he talks about the different factors that are going to be impacting you. One of the other things that Sun Tzu is very clear about is that the general really needs to be in charge of making the decisions when you're on the battlefield. And if the ruler is second guessing or undermining the general, that's ultimately going to cause problems through the ranks. And I would say that there's a great that's very applicable to campaigns. You don't want to have the candidate undermining the campaign manager. You want to have a campaign manager who actually has the ability to bring command focus and the ability to run the campaign, and let, if they have enough experience and they're smart, they should be able to run the campaign. The candidate can go be the candidate. So that's one of the things that I've gotten from it as well. So the other thing I've mentioned before is he talks a lot about spies, which we would call intel, and that's research today, is really know your opponent as you know yourself. And that's ultimately what brought about is from Sun Tzu. The Olson strategy sweet spot is know your enemy as you know yourself, and you will be, more often than not, you'll be victorious. So the idea of your strengths and your opponent's weaknesses, and then what voters care about, and that's what we've added to that, and that's ultimately going to be the best place to do battle. All right, next one I have here is strategic intuition. Now, this one is, I'm mentioning this one specifically because I really like the subject of it. Oh, before I move on, one of the honorable mentions that I'm going to mention that isn't, so I'm going to put this with The Art of War. The Art of War was Sun Tzu was a great thinker from 2,500 years ago, whereas Miyamoto Musashi was Japanese, and he was a samurai, and he was around about 500 years ago or so. And his book is the Book of Five Rings, also a very short book. It's a very dense book. It's about the art of being a samurai and really sword fighting. And I've gotten stuff out of this, but what's interesting about that, and then there's an interesting novel called Musashi, which is about, the legend of his life and his various battles that he fought. I would recommend it, but it's definitely deeper reading. It's a little bit dense, and in thinking about how to apply, sword maneuvers to political strategies is difficult. The one thing that is definitely we use in our work, he was a big fan of the two sword technique, a long sword and a short sword. One was for defense and one was for offense. And I apply that to how I think about communications. You have a defensive communication, which ultimately is, in my opinion, where you're prodding and poking your opponent. You're keeping them busy. And then you have your offensive communications, which is ultimately your overall message, the choice that you're presenting. So you're keeping your opponent occupied so they can't be attacking you. And then you're putting forward your overall message that is really presenting the choice, and it's the positive choice that you're giving people. So that's something that's come from that. But that's a really interesting, between all those books, you watch the development of warfare and strategy in the Asian context from about 2,000 years, which is interesting. The next one is Strategic Intuition. And I love this book. It's by William Dugan. William Dugan is the author of this book. It's called Strategic Intuition. This is number 2, The Creative Spark in Human Achievement. And this is brilliant. It really breaks down Karl von Clausewitz on war, von Krieg in German. And von Clausewitz is a very dense read, hard to really get stuff out of it, but do recommend it for, I'll probably put that in the 7 more great reads for strategic thinking. But it's a great book, but ultimately William Dugan breaks it down. He talks about strategic intuition, that flash of insight, which was what von Clausewitz called it was coup d'oeil. That's French for flash of the eye. And it's really interesting. So von Clausewitz was in the Prussian forces during Napoleon's reign. So Napoleon is the emperor of France or Europe or whatever he called himself. And he was trying to take over all of Europe. And von Clausewitz was on the other side. But he watched Napoleon, and he saw that he was, even though they didn't have the word yet, but he saw that he was one of the greatest military commanders, but he was a great strategist. And it was from that he started his writing for On War, which actually didn't come out until after he had passed away. His wife published it. But William Dugan really goes into von Clausewitz and goes into this idea of the flash of insight that a military commander has, and then applies it to all strategy, and how really von Clausewitz got that you can't do long-term strategic planning, that there's so many factors and forces, and there's really, as he turned the term you probably heard before, fog of war. There's so much uncertainty that's going to happen that you really have to be able to be planning almost on a daily basis. And what we say is, win every day. And how is it that you're going to win today? And that is going to offer up the most opportunities, the more breakthroughs, and the flash of insight. And in really being intuitive about your strategy, as opposed to be locked down and controlled and stuck in a rut long term that doesn't allow you to maneuver. But this is a great book to make von Clausewitz much more accessible to folks. So that's been a great book, and it's definitely affected my thinking. His opponent, or the other contemporary thinker on strategy, was Jomini, who was a French guy who actually talked a lot about long-term strategic planning, and probably has affected a lot of strategic thinkers to this day. But ultimately, von Clausewitz was much more of a student of Napoleon, where the French guy was actually not, and who actually had served under Napoleon. He was not much of a student of Napoleon. Okay, the next one I've got here is this is a great title, and this actually influenced our 4 pillars of strategy and how we do most of our campaigns. And this is number 3, Strategy and the Fat Smoker. And it's a great title. And the idea is that oftentimes we know what we should be doing. We know where we should be going. We know why we should be doing it. And we even know how to do it. And yet it doesn't happen. So, applying this to strategy anywhere, if you ask somebody, okay, so we have fat smokers. If you ask somebody, how could you lose weight? How could you be fit? They would say, well, you would eat well, you would reduce calories, you would exercise, you would do these things, you wouldn't smoke because that's not going to be great for your health. And yet we have fat smokers. Most of them know what to do. They know why to do it, and they even know how to do it, and yet it doesn't happen. So doing what's obvious when not easy. This is by David Meister, and it's really, it was actually this quote that really made a difference for me. It's he calls it bridging the knowing gap. And real strategy lies not in figuring out what to do, but in devising ways to ensure that compared to others, we actually do more of what everybody knows they should do. And one of the things that we say, as we've talked about, is what you do daily gets done. That's one of the ideas. There's another quote. We want the benefits of these things. We know what to do. We know why we should do it, and we know how to do it. Yet most businesses and individuals don't do what's good for them. So this is business strategy, and we apply it to political strategy. And we created the 4 pillars of political strategy out of that. It's the where you're going, why you're going there, how you're going there, and then what we have is the 4th pillar is the do pillar, which we're going to be talking about. There's a few other authors that have really affected that do pillar for us, and I'm going to be going through those in a moment. But before I do that, this is there's so much work that he's done, but I'm going to give one book as an example that you can do. Michael Porter is a Harvard Business School professor, or used to be. And he has been one of the leading thinkers on business strategy since probably the 80s or 70s. And he, we have the term competitive advantage. That's a term that he created, which then we have competitive strategy, all these different things that have come from his work, strategic fit, strategic scorecard. There's just so many things that he's talked about that are really great. But the first book, this is HBR, that's Harvard Business Review, 10 must-reads on strategy, and it's going to have a lot of Michael Porter because he's by far the greatest business thinker on strategy. So a couple of his books, The 5 Competitive Forces That Shape Strategy. The 5 forces is a big impact. I think it's somewhat impacted by the 5 Rings by Miyamoto Musashi. Then he has What is Strategy? It's an excellent read. He talks about the strategic scorecard. He talks about numerous things and competitive advantage. Not all of those are in this book, but just a few things from What is Strategy. This is a really important idea, and I think a lot of political consultants and a lot of operatives get these mixed up. He says operational effectiveness is not strategy, and another way to say operational effectiveness is best practices. Best practices are great. And oftentimes in a campaign, a best practice is likely going to make a difference in the campaign. But if everybody's doing the best practices, it's not going to make a difference. And I would actually say that there's a really good example of this in politics. The 2016 presidential election, we have Donald Trump, we have Hillary Clinton. And I've told the story before, but my office in Denver, used to be in Denver, and it just so happened lovely folks at my office building, they knew I was political, and they had a new tenant, and they knew that new tenant was political, and they thought, well, we'll just put them next to each other. Well, they happened to put Hillary Clinton's campaign for that for in Denver for that area right next door to my office, which of course I was at that time. I was supporting the Trump convention, national convention, and whatnot. It was kind of crazy. Every once in a while, we'd find people leaning against our door, trying to hear what's going on. It was kind of absurd. But one of the things I observed is that every time we walked by the office and they used one of the common conference rooms to organize, they were a well-oiled machine. They were doing all the things by the book. They had the best practices. They had people coming in, but it was always dead. Like there was no joy, there's no excitement. And then the Trump campaign was about half a mile down the road in a little building in the middle of Denver, and it was not in a friendly territory. And oftentimes we go down there, there's people outside doing honking waves, waving at all the liberal Denverites, and they're getting flipped off, and they're not doing anything really productive. People are inside, no one really knows what to do, but there's like tons of people. There's all this excitement. There's a lot of interest, and you can really look at it in the strategy or the slogans. Make America Great Again. There was a real clear purpose to that. Then you had you knew the issues that Trump was going to take action on. You had a real sense of where he was going. And then you had Hillary Clinton, and her slogan is "I'm with her." Like, what's that about? Like, nobody really quite got what Hillary Clinton candidacy was. And that's a great example of, I think Trump had an overall strategy, whereas Hillary didn't have an overall strategy, but she had best practices, and ultimately somebody who was strategic beat the one who had the best practices. So that's one idea. There's so many ideas from Michael Porter that he talks about. He talks about strategic fit. That's the idea of all the actions you're taking that work together to create that choice. He also talks about choices as well. Like, you can't do everything. If you try to do everything, you're ultimately going to diffuse your force. So you have to think about, what are the things I'm going to choose to do and not do the other things. A lot of campaigns ultimately try to do everything, or they have 1,000 ideas and they try to implement all of them, and they ultimately don't do any of them well enough to win. So that's a couple of things I've gotten from Michael Porter. Number 4 on the list, and I would get the On Strategy Harvard Business Review's 10 must reads. Recommend that one for Michael Porter. Next one, I have number 5. This is the 3 Laws of Performance by Steve Zaffron and Dave Logan. And this is it's an excellent book. We've done a whole episode on this book, and it really I'm going to pull them up, but there's some powerful ideas that this is focused on. So the 3 laws of performance and the leadership corollaries. So the first law of performance, how people perform correlates to how situations occur to them. So how a situation occurs to them, the context, the culture, how people perform, what they do, and how they act in your organization is going to correlate. It's going to follow how the situation, how their experience is in the organization, how it occurs to them. And the leadership corollary that they have, what you can take away from that is, leaders have a say and give others a say in how situations occur to them. So basically, this is the person who shows up and says, you know what, we've been viewing things in a context. We've been viewing things a certain way. It's kind of a mental prison, and it's just something of our own making. If we looked at it differently, maybe we would have different actions happening. So that's the first law of performance. Second law of performance, how a situation occurs in language, or how a situation occurs arises in language. That's the second law of performance. And what that means is that how something occurs to you, and this is why some people call it a mental prison, it just occurs in language in your head. It's how you talk to yourself about it. It's how people talk about it in the organization. It's the assumptions of how it is, and you can just break that down. It shows up in language. It's how people are talking about it. It's how it occurs to them. So the leadership corollary, the thing that you can do as a leader about it, is leaders master the conversational environment. So they're very much involved in kind of leading the conversation within the organization, how people talk about things, how the challenges of the organization occur to people. Are they always a glass half full, or are they always a glass half empty? How do people actually see and experience the situation within the organization? You've been in those organizations before where everybody's down in the dumps, or everybody just assumes you're going to lose in a campaign. You're going to start taking loser actions if that's everybody's way they look at it. So it's important for a candidate, for a campaign manager, to be responsible for how you talk about the campaign and the kinds of things you're talking about moving it towards a place that's going to create performance. The third law of performance: further future-based language transforms how situations occur to people. And this is why we talk so much about vision. We had yesterday, uh, we had a great replay of our Inside the Vision conversation. It's why we make such a big deal about the vision of a campaign. It may not be the overall message of the campaign, the choice that's being presented, but ultimately, if you have a clear vision of what your service for the country is going to be as a candidate, you're going to have a clear sense of what the choices you're going to present to voters. It's going to make sense to the communications director what to talk about, the political director to have volunteers talking about. It's just going to start to give a lot more clarity, and you're working towards something. It also gives people something to live into, something bigger than any one person. So, this is the leadership corollary here. What leaders do about that is leaders listen for the future of their organization. So not only do they tell people this is where you're going, they actually listen to folks. This is something that's so important in fundraising calls. You have an idea of what your vision is, but you present it to the other person. You talk about, what you're about, but it's really in the listening to the donor, the prospective donor, hearing what they have to say. That's where the magic happens. When they start adding to it, when they start creating that vision with you, they're bought in. And, asking for that maxed out donation is much easier at that point. So those are the three laws. I recommend people go back and watch that. Sean and I talk a lot about the three laws of performance in that one. So do check that out. Now, the next two, they're all kind of fit into this. There's one of the things I talked about earlier was strategic systems, the campaign performance system, the strategic flywheel that we implement in our campaigns. And the person who really made that clear, I've mentioned him before, he's actually made it into a number of our 7 greats. This is Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert, his book, How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big, kind of the story of my life. This is number 6 on the list. And the great thing about this, he walks through his life. He has a lot of, self-help type stuff in here. He talks about his challenges. He lost his ability to speak for several years and what have you. But this chapter has impacted so many different people and so many different books. There's books like Atomic Habits and a number of books. Skip the Line is another book that uses the idea of goals versus systems. Goals don't cause performance. Goals aren't really that powerful. Now they're useful in some cases. We always have goals in our campaign plans, but really systems is where the action are. If we go back to the 4 pillars of strategy that we've created, the last pillar is the do pillar. Systems of accountability, systems of the things that you're doing on a daily basis. These are the things that are going to cause opportunity to happen. So if you do these certain things every single day, this is my system. I'm going to, for instance, on a campaign, the more people you talk to, the more opportunity is going to show up. That's a strategic system that we implement in every campaign. That means we're making phone calls. That means we're talking to as many press as we can. But if you're not talking to people, then you're probably doing something wrong in a campaign if you're a candidate. So that's a strategic system. The more people you talk to, the more opportunity shows up. I can't tell you how many conversations it's going to take. I can guess, but ultimately, if you're making calls and you're talking to people constantly about what you see as possible for the country, for the state, for your community, then you're going to have more opportunities show up. So thinking about strategic systems. So that's one of the big things that came from that book. Again, it's How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big, kind of the story of my life by Scott Adams. That's number 6. And that goes into number 7, which is it's a really good book. You might even say it's great. It's the number 7 is Good to Great by Jim Collins. He's a fellow Coloradan, I believe, lives in Boulder. He is a author of a number of great books, but a lot of research went into this book. And one of the ideas that's so awesome is a book or an idea that he even wrote a little shorter book called Turning the Flywheel. And this is the idea that he has that there is in any organization, you have a series of different things you're doing, systems. Here's a diagram of one. You're not going to be able to read that, but you think about that circle and there's an overall, what you're trying to cause. and you have all these different actions that all feed into each other. So you do this thing, it's going to cause more other actions to happen. So, for instance, on a campaign, the way this would work is in a campaign, I just talked about the more conversations you have, the more opportunities are going to show up. So if you're over here, communications folks are trying to get as many opportunities for you to be visible so that you are on TV, you have great radio interviews, you get into the newspapers. And so they're causing all this great content. And ultimately, it's third party verification. You're in the news, and then that's taken by your data people or your digital people, and they're using it to send it through social media. They're sending emails. They're sending all their sorts of different things. So they're using that, and then that's also supporting your fundraising. Your fundraising is using that for fundraising email. It's also using it for the candidates' phone calls, so that there's some interesting things you can send to prospective donors. And like I said, then you have your candidate calling, and they're using those tools. So all these things are starting to help each other, and you start to get momentum. And the reason he talks about a flywheel, ultimately at first, it takes a little bit of push, a little bit of force to get that flywheel going, but eventually it gets enough momentum and it just starts going. You just have to give it a little bit more push, and it just keeps going. And the other way people do things, and this is one of the problems in our politics, is that we have oftentimes the other idea that he talks about, which is a doom loop. And a doom loop is a machine that just goes from one place to another place, right, left, back and forth. And every single time it changes its direction, it loses all of its momentum. And that's oftentimes how our campaign, or how politics works. All the momentum is lost. One of the sad things about this 2020 election is Donald Trump was the only person for years who really got the threat of China. And he started putting in place a lot of policies to deal with that. He also got that there was a real problem that if you don't have integrity on your border, that you don't really have a border, and that it doesn't work for the country. It's not compassionate to have a broken border. It only puts people in danger. So he started taking actions, lots of different actions that were really a strategic flywheel that all worked together, from, ending catch and release, having the remain in Mexico policy, building the wall. All these things had a strategic fit. They all fit together in a strategic flywheel that together it made border security happen almost overnight. It wasn't overnight, but it's the fastest I've ever seen a policy be implemented. All these different actions working together to have the policy change. And then we watched in February where Biden broke the border so fast by breaking down all those things. So that's a case of the doom loop. We had so much going one way, and then all of a sudden we go the other way, and all the momentum is lost. So that's an example of that. On China, you see Biden capitulating to China constantly, and we're losing that momentum. So that's the idea of the flywheel versus the doom loop. It's a really great strategic idea that hopefully is helpful to you. You want to be doing things in your campaign, actions that fit together to cause that momentum to happen. So those are my 7, and with the honorable mentions of, after you've done those, to read von Clausewitz on war, Miyamoto's Musashi's Book of Five Rings. Those are 2 excellent honorable mentions. But you start with those other ones: The Art of War, Strategic Intuition, Strategy and the Fat Smoker, Harvard Business Reviews on strategy, in particular the Michael Porter articles, The 3 Laws of Performance, How to Fail at Almost Anything and Still Win Big, and then Good to Great. Those are all excellent strategic reads. You read those, your strategic abilities are going to shoot up. You're going to have new insights. You're going to see openings. You're going to have that kudo, that flash of insight that Clausewitz talked about. You're going to see openings that you didn't see before. So recommend those. Hope you enjoyed those. And if you enjoy those, I think you're going to enjoy working with some organizations who ultimately implement a lot of these things. One of those would be Olson Strategies. And, Sean and I would love to talk to you about your campaign. We'd love to talk to you about whether or not you should run or not. We're not going to suggest that you should run if it's not the best thing for you. So please do sign up to have a free consultation. You can go to olsonstrategies.com. You can email me, Dustin at olsonstrategies.com, or Sean, Sean, at olsonstrategist.com. And please do check in with us and see how we can help you have the right strategy for you to win and create that performance system in your campaign to give you opportunities. So we'd love to do that. And then additionally, if you really want the absolute best grassroots partner, you want somebody who's going to represent you well at people's doors. You're going to want people who represent you well in front of the grocery store. You want people who are going to represent you well on the phone. Reach out to Grassfire LLC. It's at grassfire.us. You can schedule a complimentary consultation there for canvassing, petitioning, live calling. By far the absolute best in the country when it comes to petitioning. I can't stress how important it is if you're going to run for office, if you're going to put initiatives on the ballot. You got to be on the ballot for you to win. So petitioning is extremely important. A lot of people overlook it. They do not. They make sure that all of the T's are crossed, all the I's are dotted, so that people's First Amendment right to petition their government is actually honored, and highly recommend them. And they also fuel 10centtexting.com. It is amazing to me just how much this is really the slingshot, David's slingshot that took out the giant. So recommend people use 10centtexting.com. By far the best price, best quality that you can get for political texting. Launch your message today. Go to 10centtexting.com, sign up. They can have that done within 24 hours. So do check that out. With that, hopefully you've enjoyed this 7 great reads for strategic thinking. Share it with people. Who knows who you might inspire to step up, speak up, and show up for our country. It is so important that we all, as American citizens, that we are active in this process. And I really do appreciate you choosing to spend some time here on this morning to talk about how to effectively have your vision for your community, for your state, for our country become a reality. So thank you. Until next time, this has been another episode of Political Trade Secrets.
Join us next time by subscribing on iTunes and get show notes and sign up for our newsletter at politicaltradesecrets.com.